So good evening. I am Catherine Barr-Windells. I'm a Coolidge trustee. I'm delighted to be here to introduce a very timely subject, but it's not just timely, it's one of perennial pertinence, I'd like to say that, to ordinary people. I happen to be reading a book about Jane Austen. Every speech must start with Jane Austen to me. And especially because this is a Salon, right? So a Salon, very, very Jane Austen. I was reading a book in which the author talked about Jane Austen's characters, all of whom knew to the penny exactly how much capital every other character had and what income it produced. Mr. Darcy had $10,000 a year, Mr. Bingley only $5,000. You know, big difference, ladies. So at any rate, at one point the author in the book said, of this book about Jane Austen, said gentility was expensive. And my 2025 self said, gentility, try eggs. So President Calvin Coolidge was a president who understood the importance of sound money for the ordinary person, for their purchase of eggs and everything else. And that is why we at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation wish to honor him, to make people more aware of him, but most importantly, to bring his principles to bear on our current national discourse and actions where they are very badly, very desperately needed. One way we do this is through the Coolidge book salons, where authors discuss American history in the context of Coolidge principles. My late husband, Paul Windells III, was devoted to the study of history, and oh boy, was he devoted to Calvin Coolidge. He could tell more Coolidge anecdotes than anyone except for Amity Schlaze. That is saying something. Our family is privileged to support these salons. Along with Coolidge Chair Amity Schlaze, Coolidge President Matthew Denhart, our board, and the rest of the Coolidge team, the wonderful Coolidge team, we are happy to welcome you tonight. Our last salon featured Christopher Cox, former head of the SEC, former member of Congress, and his splendid biography of Woodrow Wilson, which I urge you to acquire and read if you haven't. Tonight, Wilson was probably the very reverse of Coolidge, but tonight we will hear from a guest of honor who is actually in tune with the permanent truths exemplified in Coolidge's public life. I would therefore like to invite to the front of the room two people. The first is our interviewer, Seth Lipsky of the New York Sun, who for many years has written on monetary policy. Second, our guest of honor, Dr. Judy Shelton. Seth will interview Judy for about 20 minutes. We will then take questions from you, our guests. The first question will be posed by Thomas Hoenig, longtime president of the Kansas City Fed. And now, Seth and Judy.
Thank you, Kathy. And welcome, friends. And Judy, my assignment from Amity tonight is to give a brief, B-R-I-E-F, introduction of Judy and to moderate a friendly conversation. And I'm very happy to do it. I'm a great admirer of Judy. She's a monetary economist and an author with a PhD from the University of Utah. She came to fame with a book she wrote during the Cold War, a famous book, a scoop, predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union. She's also famous for having been nominated by President Trump to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, only to be rejected in a badge of honor over her support for honest money. Amity and I first became acquainted with Judy through the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, for which Judy has written over the years, more than 50 columns of astonishing clarity and principle. They have made her one of the leading voices in the debate over how to fix what broke in the 1970s with the collapse of the post-war World War II monetary system in which America linked its dollar to gold at a 35th of an ounce, and the rest of the world linked to us. So I'm going to ask It's been said of newspaper editors that they are walking vessels of ignorance. And I'm going to make my questions simple in the Jane Austen spirit. And Judy, I want to ask you to talk to this group about what I have called the best column you ever wrote. It was called God and Money, and it was based on the Bible's book of Deuteronomy. And then after which we can get into some of the other questions. But share with this wonderful group what you were talking about in that column.
Seth, thank you so much. I feel I have to stand at least just for a moment. I am just overwhelmed. I'm so touched that this wonderful group would come here. I see my great friend David Malpass, former head of the World Bank. He was kind of my boss. He was the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs when I was representing the U.S. in London at a multilateral development bank, his great wife, Adele. And that Tom Honig being here, he was the head of the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank for 20 years. And a book was written called The Lords of Easy Money. He is the hero of that book for being the lone dissenting vote on the Monetary Policy Committee decisions because he thought all of this zero interest rate, easy money is going to have repercussions that will not be good in terms of distorting investment and magnifying income inequality. And mostly, I just, Amity, thank you so much. I'm so honored that you would invite me to speak, this magnificent home, this venue, chairing the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I love Coolidge. He believed in fiscal responsibility and limited government. I mean, that's the ultimate for me. And Seth is my, Seth is the conscience of the sound money movement. And for him to go straight to the biblical references to sound money shows that he believes, and I'm sure this is what has influenced me, that money is a moral contract. It's not just Deuteronomy, it's in Proverbs, it's in Ezekiel. In my own reading yesterday, I saw another reference to honest weights and measures in the book of Micah. So it's the idea that humans trade with each other. It's probably the best aspect of being human. It gives us economic advantages over all other species. We believe in voluntary commerce. But it has to be based on honest measures. And the biblical references are referring to dishonest people who would carry two sets of weights in their bag. And maybe there was a deal, they were going to buy so much wheat for an ephah, I think was the measurement, or a tenth of an ephah was an omer. But they used gold and silver. But you had a heavy balance you would set on the scale, and then the wheat would go on the other side when you were buying. And if you were selling, you used a light balance so that you got away with cheating the person. And so it says it's an abomination to the Lord to have two sets of weights or to have two rods. It's measurement and weights. But that to me is the perfect analogy to having dishonest money, because you're really cheating people. It could be money they've earned that now is going to be debased. I mean, if the Fed hits their target, you're going to lose 2% a year. After 10 years, 20%. It's kind of a form of expropriation, really. And so that's, for me, that's why I'm interested in this topic. I'm delighted to see that it's becoming not only okay, but kind of a hot topic to discuss not just the problem of inflation and whether we need to reform the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, but even gold. And I must say, coming here this evening, I'm as everyone does, I'm checking X, I'm checking the news. And Elon Musk, who has 218 million followers, said, "The nation's gold reserves belong to the American people. I hope it's still there."
So thank you for that wonderful answer. A great deal more biblically knowledgeable than I am, and I appreciate it. Which leads me to another question. So at the end of Bretton Woods, the dollar was a 35th of an ounce of gold. And today, it's less than a 2900th of an ounce of gold, I think today's price. And if you look at a chart of it, there's almost no surcease from that collapse. I mean, it's like the New York Sun called it like skiing Tuckerman's Ravine. I mean, just the steepness of the downward curve. And you wrote a column which, like your Deuteronomy column, was kind of a scoop of recognition. It was so simple and so brilliant. And it was a column, I think you wrote it for the Wall Street Journal, about how under Janet Yellen, Chairwoman Janet Yellen and Chairman Powell, there was not a single dissenting vote in on a monetary policy matter at the board level. Do you remember that column? And what does that tell you? We've watched the dollar collapse and lose almost all of its value in gold, and yet there's no debate.
Well, I think that, Tom Honig, he was rare in dissenting from, there's a very powerful impulse toward groupthink at the Federal Reserve. And monetary policy is something different from money itself. If you're talking monetary policy, you're already saying that the function of money to provide that trustworthy measure has now become subservient to having money be yet another economic tool of government. So now you're going to use monetary policy to solve these other issues. And I think what we've seen is, even at 2% inflation, a dollar in 100 years is worth 13 cents. At 3%, it's worth 8 cents. So there was a debate at the Federal Reserve. It's from 1996, in fact. Janet Yellen was a governor at the time. She would become chair of the Fed. Alan Greenspan was chair of the Fed. But it was over this idea of whether the Fed's mandate to achieve stable prices should mean zero inflation, which is how Greenspan initially interpreted it, or should it mean stable inflation? And she kind of talked them into saying we should target inflation at 2 or 3%. And the idea is the average person won't understand that their wages aren't keeping up with inflation. It's called money illusion in Keynesian economics. But it's this idea that if, let's say in an economy, it contracted 1%. And normally every firm should say, hey, we're all in this together, to their employees, everyone gets a 1% cut. The theory is, no, people wouldn't accept that. So it's better if you have, say, 2% inflation. You could give people a 1% raise, but it's the same as giving them a 1% cut, because now the nominal amount exceeds the real wage gain. And this was based on a survey of people that Janet Yellen, who's married to George Akerlof. He's a very esteemed economist. I used him in my own doctoral dissertation. I referenced him. But he kind of gets into this human behavior aspect of economics. And he had taken a survey asking people, if you got a raise, but it was only equal to the amount of inflation, would you still be happy? And apparently, at least half of the workers said, yeah. And I get why they would, because usually the inflation hits and it takes a year or two before you finally get to catch up. But then immediately after that, and the transcripts show it, Janet Yellen said to the people assembled around the big boardroom table at the Fed, you'll be happy to know we gave the same survey to economists. If you had a raise, but it was only equal to the amount of inflation, would you still feel gratified? And they said no. And it records laughter. And I thought that's sort of a hubris, that the economists thought, we don't fall for money illusion, but that average guy does. And I think what we've seen is unions bargain now. They are very alert to this little trick. So I don't think you're as ahead of the game in using monetary policy to try to stimulate economies or try to make things happen that the government thinks it wants to happen, but you're really going against the organic nature of a free market economy, where people are smart.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to ask you next about Russia. You came to fame with your book about Russia, and this will sound a little bit flaky maybe, but what did you learn about Russia that's relevant, about Soviet Russia, that is relevant to America today? And who was in worse shape? Russia at the end of the Soviet period or America right now? I mean, our central bank is running at a loss, and the dollar is at this long Tuckerman's Ravine steep dive. How does what you learned about Russia fit in?
Well, I think when I studied the internal monetary and financial condition of the Soviet Union, so that really does date me. This was going back to 1985, and I proposed to look at that, and it received a postdoctoral fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford to look at that. Because it was based on the question of why are Western governments making loans to the Soviet Union, as they were starting to do in the mid-'80s, because Mikhail Gorbachev had come in, and even Margaret Thatcher said, we can do business with this man. So I wanted to find out I had a very dry title for my paper that the fellowship was based on, which was, what is the impact of Western capital on the Soviet economy? But it turned out to be kind of this green eye shade analysis of looking at and interpreting the Russian internal financial statements. Because I say Russian, but the Soviet, because there is kind of a difference. But the Soviet approach was perfectly balanced. The Soviet Union always ran a perfectly balanced down to two places beyond the decimal point of revenues and expenditures. But I started noticing, going through years and years leading up to, the book came out in January of 1989, but seeing that there was this increasing gap with, if any of you are accountants, you would see it as what you might call a plug figure. And it kept getting bigger and bigger. They kept calling this category revenues from the socialist economy. And what was happening is the Russian banking system, which Lenin had set up, and he said, and we take this ready-made from the West, banks will be the structure of communism because they will take in funds from the public and channel them up to the government. So the big thing I noticed, and compared to our situation, it was using Gosbank, which comes from Государственный Bank, that in the state-run bank of the Soviet Union. They were taking in rubles from the workers had to put their savings in the banks, channeling them straight to their government, which was spending more than it was receiving, so running what amounted to a huge budget deficit. Now, in our country, when we do that, deficit spending, we get inflation. But if you have a communist government where prices are fixed, the prices don't change. The lines get longer because you still have not enough goods to supply the people. What I fear, and probably made a mistake in mentioning during the nomination process, was to say a practice the Fed started in the post-2008 era was the Federal Reserve no longer relies as its primary mechanism for influencing, well, really controlling, I would probably say manipulating interest rates. It doesn't rely on what we used to call open market operations, the way Paul Volcker did it. It pays interest on reserves. So there's $3.2 trillion in reserve accounts. These are cash accounts that banks are required to hold at the Fed. It says this is the interest rate. It doesn't seek any market response to that. This is the interest rate because we say so. And that sort of diktat approach to setting interest rates, to me, is very Soviet-esque. And I think I unfortunately used that word. And then, because during my hearing, someone said, she compared our situation to the Soviet system. But I will say this, I think our economy is infinitely worthy of hope and shows so much more promise than the Soviet system was defunct, and there was just no going back, as we saw even as Russia took over. The Soviet Union ended in December 1991, and I had gone over there in April 1991, and the finance minister had my book on his table in his office. But that country ended. It's just what replaced it, sadly, still likes a managed economy with the government controlling the resources.
Did they have dissenting votes in the board?
Only Putin, probably. Yeah. No, they actually, it's ironic. Russia's considered to have a pretty good central banker. It's a woman, and she's kept them going. Apparently she wanted to quit after they invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, and they wouldn't let her. But so they've managed to do the best possible given very deteriorating circumstances in their economy.
Okay, so I'm interested in how optimistic you are or pessimistic you might be about the prospects for reforming our own monetary system. We talk about monetary reform a lot in the Sun. The Republican campaign platforms, national platforms, used to have a plank on calling for the establishment of a monetary commission to see how the Federal Reserve has worked in its first century. Didn't make it out of Congress. I always thought it was a good idea. I think David Malpass might have a different view. We can get him to weigh in if he's still here. And you've written a new book.
Yes.
I just thought and how does your program in that book fit in with, the case for the possibility of monetary reform? How are you thinking about all that?
Well, I will say just to talk about reforming the Fed is now, it used to be seen as a radical position, is now starting to look centrist when you see some of the things, and I'm talking about even in the last few weeks and few days that are being said. Senator Mike Lee is calling for an end to the Fed. I mentioned Elon Musk. Last week, he endorsed Ron Paul to replace Jerome Powell as head of the Fed. And Ron Paul wrote End the Fed in 2008, I believe. There are no rules. I mean, Congress has constitutionally the responsibility to regulate the money. It's in Article 1, Section 8. No one would know that better than Seth Lipsky. But it's in the same sentence that also gives Congress the power to define official weights and measures, because again, money was meant to be a measure. And Congress really farmed out that responsibility to a government agency, the Federal Reserve. So I think ostensibly you would have to go to Congress to reform the Fed, but Congress then is a little leery of impinging on the independence of the Fed. That's been built up as something very important. We can talk about what the Fed says about why they are independent within government, even though they are a self-admitted government agency. But
could I footnote that?
Yeah,
just one
please.
minor footnote. The New York Sun's position is that independence of the Fed is unconstitutional, that Congress has the monetary powers. Just to
Well,
make it simple.
and yet Congress has imposed no limits on how much government debt the Federal Reserve can buy. There are no limits on how much money the Federal Reserve can print based on a keystroke. People say they do it out of thin air. It honestly is. They just credit a bank's account when they purchase Treasury securities or mortgage-backed securities from that bank or institution. And there are no limits on how much money the Federal Reserve can pay to commercial banks. This is this practice I alluded to of paying interest on reserves. On their cash, they pay them a pretty hefty rate, currently 4.4%, to leave the cash sitting there to do nothing. Where would it go if they quit paying that? That was an emergency rule adopted in October 2008 that the Fed could pay interest on reserves. And now the banks keep these tremendous amounts of reserves sitting there doing nothing that at least could go into longer-term treasuries and start to bring those yields down, like the 10-year. Everyone wonders why it's out of kilter with the short-term rate. Or even better, they could lend it to the private sector. But instead, I see it as, you could call it inducement, or you could say the Fed pays them not to loan the money. The fact that people as influential as Senator Lee, who's a constitutionalist, as influential as Seth Lipsky, but he's long had this position about Congress having abandoned, really, its responsibility. And then you throw in Elon Musk endorsing Ron Paul, there's something afoot. And then last week, in an Oval Office interview, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said something about, we're going to monetize the assets of the United States and have them work for the American people. Well, the U.S. is the largest holder of gold reserves, 261 million ounces. We carry them at a book value of $42.22 an ounce, and as you said, they're over $2,900. There is a potential windfall profit approaching $800 billion. And now I see claimants arising. That's a lot of money. And then, as I say, today, Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul, the father of Ron Paul.
Son of Ron Paul.
Oh, excuse me, the son, I apologize. The son was on Fox Business this morning calling for an audit of Fort Knox. So this topic that I think kind of set me off as a fringe, even though gold is almost, historically gold has been a monetary system, actually going back thousands of years, unlike Bitcoin. And yet now it's a hot topic. It's a hot topic, and ideally it's a hot topic in conjunction with this idea of sound money and reforming the Fed, so maybe something can actually start to happen.
So, that's great, Judy. Thank you for going through the basics for me. I needed a refresher course constantly. Tom Hainig, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think that, number one, the Fed does need a rule-based system, which they don't have. There's discretion since 1971 and beyond, actually. But here's my question. I agree with everything you say. I see the mounting debt of the United States, which is overwhelming GDP, in place, and the interest on the debt of $1 trillion a year. Let's say you went to a gold standard, whatever you said, that would impose such discipline on the country that it would scare people to death, especially Congress, and so forth. How do you think, is there a way to transition from where we are to a standard where we have very strong rules, the gold standard, or something as strong as, so that we can, in fact, set the measure and keep it there? Is there a transition that you think might work?
Yes, I think we can transition. And first off, there's 2.4 trillion in Federal Reserve notes, so that's currency that's out there, and about 70% of U.S. dollars in paper money floats outside the country and is used in nefarious things around the world that we're not even quite sure how much is circulating. But as I say, as considerable as our reserve assets are, they would only cover a third of that if you really had one for one. I'm not talking about going to a gold standard in the sense that somehow you could take paper money and give it to the government and they would pay you. I'm talking about a gold-backed treasury security, which would be the first time since 71. Actually, it took till February of 73 to finish off the system. It would be the first time the U.S. Treasury had an official government debt instrument that linked the dollar to gold. And I'm saying, let's use those reserves. Let's take the windfall profit, but let's not sell them. Let's not let the next administration sell it. Let's make that specific collateral and warehouse it and issue against it a 50-year Treasury bond. Now, that's something we considered during the Trump transition. Treasury looked at it. We only go out 30 years, but there's 7 countries have 50-year bonds, France and China and Canada and Singapore. That's not so unusual. But here's why I think this could be an interesting idea, especially for President Trump. Next year is going to be huge, the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. Where do we expect to be in 2076 on the 300th? I mean, let's look at the really big picture. Since you asked sort of about our financial future and sustainability, are we still going to be standing tall? Do we believe the United States will be here? I mean, we probably won't, but I'm sure anyone with kids under the age of 30, they likely will. Your kids will be there. So wouldn't our ideal be, what if our 36 trillion in debt had been whittled down to 0? What if we had no outstanding government debt? What if we had a balanced budget? What if we had 0 inflation? That would be something to shoot for. Well, let's think. Over the next 10 years, even if we got to a balanced budget at the end of the 10 years, we're still going to be running deficits the first part of that. Let's say we only add another 4 trillion, because this year alone we're going to add over 2 trillion more from deficit spending, of which half, as Tom mentioned, is to pay interest on that debt. What a waste. But let's say we whittle it down and only 4 trillion more. So then after year 10 of a 50-year span, we have 40 years now and 40 trillion in debt. Let's say we can start running a budget surplus in a very Hamiltonian way, paying back, have a sinking fund, paying back $1 trillion a year. So we whittle it down to zero debt. I mean, that's what we're talking about. This instrument I'm suggesting, you would price it so that what you're saying to a bondholder is, would you rather have $2,900 today or an ounce of gold? And they're going to say, I'm indifferent. That's the price. Well, in 50 years, would you rather have $2,900 or an ounce of gold? And as Seth said, that inexorable decline of the dollar, it's laughable. Of course you'd think that would be worth more. But maybe there's something in between. If the Fed hits its target of 2% starting now for the next 50 years, $2,900 for an ounce of gold now would cost $7,700 in 50 years. So maybe you make the face value, the amount you get back at the end of the life of the bond, equal to that amount. So then if the Fed and the fiscal agents, I mean, if you get squared away on not overspending and on keeping inflation in check, and you show fiscal and monetary responsibility and you do better than the market expects, then that will be an unbelievable bargain for the government to raise money that way. People will pay a premium for that instrument. Our dream would be that at the end of the 50 years, they'd rather have the dollar. If you could make the dollar as good as gold, people would rather have the dollar. But this instrument would be a way to start to begin to focus on the concept of a dollar as good as gold. It would be the beginning of, I think other countries should issue the same sort of instrument, because at some point then, if every country that you trade with did, you'd have the beginnings of a future stable exchange rate system, a level international monetary playing field. You could also just use this instrument, just like a TIPS bond, if you're familiar with the Treasury Inflation Protected Security, that compensates you for inflation defined by the CPI. This one would compensate you for inflation as measured by the price of gold, maybe a surrogate for the real economy for a lot of people.
All right. So there's the plan from our hero. I want to say one other thing here. David Thoreau of the Independent Institute, the late David Thoreau, Mr. Briggs, is he here? And Mary Thoreau, who helped out on all this on Judy's book. Mr. Briggs is your publisher, right?
He was my editor.
Editor. Where is he? He was here. Anyhow, congratulations. It's a great read. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Amity and Coolidge.